Okay, so we're live?
We're live, yes.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone who is tuning in to this YouTube chat. We're gonna wait for some more people to come in the room. And while we do that, I'm going to introduce myself and tell you a little bit about the ACCA, the American Cultural Center Algiers. So I'm Emily Walker. I work in the public affairs section at the US Embassy in Algiers. Part of my job is overseeing the different cultural centers around Algeria. The one in Algiers is called the American Cultural Center Algiers, or the ACCA for short. We have it's kind of a media cultural center. We have thousands of books that people can rent or lease to take home. We do a bunch of workshops, classes, lectures, and discussions throughout the week. This is in normal times, non-pandemic times. Normally, we're open Sundays through Wednesdays from 9 to 3. And we have a bunch of cool sessions. For instance, we do a weekly English learning class. We do a weekly learning English through music class where we have a volunteer come in and play a bunch of songs. It's a really fun sing-along. We also have a weekly entrepreneurship class that's taught by a business professor. So we have a bunch of cool activities. If you're in Algiers, I encourage you to come and check us out. We're attached to the American Embassy, which is located in LBR. Anyone can show up. You don't need to call ahead and make an appointment. You can show up. You just need to bring a government ID. Don't bring any electronics, and you have to come through our embassy security. But we really encourage you to come and check out our programs. If you're not in Algiers, we also have cultural centers located in Oran, Constantine, Wergela, and Bashar. So if you're in those areas, you should check out those centers. We're hosting this talk as part of the ACCA. And this is part of our Let's Chat series, where we have an American talk about something cultural about American culture that is of interest to them. So with that, I would like to introduce you to our speaker for today. This is my colleague Khaled. He's the press attaché and spokesperson for the US Embassy in Algeria. He's been with the State Department, which is the American equivalent of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for 7 years. He did his previous tours in Cyprus and then Jordan. And before he joined the State Department, he was in academia. He was a lecturer of Arabic for 4 years at Tufts University and then at Harvard University. And he worked for Middlebury's College Study Abroad program in Alexandria, Egypt for 2 years. Khaled has a master's degree in Arab studies from Georgetown University in the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. He studied intensive Arabic in Cairo for a year, and he has a bachelor's degree in political science from Swarthmore College, which is near Philadelphia. He's married and has 2 young children. And during this COVID-19 crisis, he's with his family in Boston. But most of the other embassy staff are here in Algiers, but we are, of course, staying home and teleworking, which is why we are bringing this virtual talk to you rather than in person. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Khaled for his presentation, Islam in America. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments, and we will try to answer your questions in the comment section of YouTube, or we will get Khaled to answer them on air. So I'm going to turn this over to him.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Khaled Wolfsberg. Can you guys see me? Is my camera working?
Looks good to me.
You can see me? Okay, great. I'm the spokesperson at the US Embassy here in Algiers, and some of you may know me from our Facebook and Instagram pages. Usually our content is online on our social media is in Arabic or in Algerian dialect. But this talk is going to be in English because it's for Algerians who are learning English or looking for ways to practice their English. So as Emily said, the American Cultural Center is a great resource for learning Arabic. We really miss you guys a lot, and we're hoping that we're trying to offer you basically more online content right now, given the coronavirus lockdown and the need to maintain social distancing and avoid in-person gatherings at present. But let me start off with a question. Okay, there we go. No. Okay. Everyone can see this? All right, so here's a question for you guys. If you can, please write the answer on our YouTube page. Just take your best guess. No need to look up the actual answer online or anything. Our questions are, firstly, what would you guess that the Muslim population in the US is? The overall population of the US is about 330 million. So you can guess either a percentage or a number for the Muslim population in the US. The second question is, where would you guess that most Muslim Americans are born? So what country or countries would you guess that most Muslim Americans are born? If you can, write your answers in the comments, and Emily will jump in as soon as we start getting any answers. But generally during this talk, I'm going to be giving kind of a picture of the demographics of Muslims in America.
Paul Hassan, I have a guess for you here.
Okay.
Hassan guesses 20%.
Okay.
20%.
So that Muslims are 20% of the population of the United States. All right. So I'm going to be going over, starting with kind of demographics to give you a better idea of the social and economic conditions of Muslims in the United States. And then I'll be switching over also to a personal anecdote at the end that can hopefully give some color to these numbers.
Paul, can I give you 2 more guesses? Hyatt guesses 25%, and someone named SSAA guesses it's only 1%, and he thinks they're mostly in New Jersey.
Okay, so SSAA is pretty close because it is actually about 1%. So there are about 3.35 million Muslims, which is 1% of the population of the United States. They're not mostly in New Jersey, but there are some. So also, here's a nice quote I wanted to share with you guys before we look at where they're from, the second part of the question, what countries they were born in. No other country in the world has such diversity within its Muslim population. You can say that a small replica of the Muslim world is living in America. That is according to the executive director of the Center for Islam and Public Policy at Georgetown University. And so with regards to the guesses by Hassan and SSA and somebody else, Hayat, I think, we don't have 3.35 million is, or 1% of the population is an educated guess. We don't have an exact number. And the reason that we don't know exactly how many Muslims live in the US is because the US census measures the population of the United States every 10 years, but it does not ask questions about religious affiliation. Or more exactly, it has not asked these questions since the 1950s. There have not been any mandatory questions on religion. The reason for that, in turn, is that because this was seen as potentially violating the separation between church and state, which means in American politics that there has to be a separation between the state or the government and all religions. We say church and state, but it means all religions. So for example, my religion isn't written on my passport or my driver's license or any other government ID card or identity card. But that being said, we do have estimates for how many Muslims there are in the US. And as we said, about Pew Research Center estimates that they're about 1%, 3.35. The second part of the question was where Muslim Americans were born. Do we have any guesses there yet, Emily? Or still coming in?
Yes, we had a guess that New York is probably where most of the Muslims in America were born.
Okay, so, okay, I should have specified what country, because the data, the survey that we have divides it up into the United States versus other countries. So according to another Pew Research Center survey, you're going to hear me mentioning the Pew Research Center a lot. In 2017, 42% of Muslims were born in the United States. Oops. I think I skipped over my slide there. Okay, here we go. 42% were born in the United States, 14% in MENA, or the Middle East and North Africa, so that would include Algeria, 20% in South Asia, 6% in Iran, and then smaller numbers everywhere around the world, basically between Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera. So you can see why that Georgetown professor I mentioned highlighted how diverse the Muslim American community is. Muslims in the US are coming from all types of ethnic backgrounds, Sunnis and Shia and all the different schools of thought within Islam. And also, as you can see from this chart, the Muslim population in the United States is growing steadily. Oops. So it's grown from about 2.35 million in 2007 to now 3.35 or 3.45 million in 2017, which is pretty close to 50% growth in 10 years. So my question for you guys is why? Why is the Muslim population growing in the United States? In your opinion, what do you think are some of the reasons for that? If you're just joining us, thanks for being here. We're experimenting with this YouTube live format as a way to reach more people while the American Center is closed, of course, due to the COVID-19 lockdown. We do plan on producing more content exclusively for our YouTube page in the near future, so you should subscribe. Where's the subscribe button? Is it that way? That way? Anyway, it's below me. Right. Okay. Okay, down into my right. Oh, this is confusing. Okay. So subscribe, because we will be having, okay. You'll see it there. It'll say subscribe or abonné or whatever.
We don't have any guesses yet here why people think the Muslim population in the United States is growing. Oh wait, we have one that just came in. Sifu BK, yes, the diversity visa program, probably.
Okay, so that's a good guess. The diversity visa program, exactly. The point of that program, which was instituted, first passed by Congress in 1990 or possibly in 1991, don't quote me on that, early 1990s, was to basically make America more diverse in terms of the backgrounds, the national backgrounds that Americans are coming from. And we'll talk a little bit more about immigration soon. But immigration is definitely one part of that.
Another guest we have from SSAA is possibly just there's more births, it's newborns, people having more kids.
Yep, so that's, yeah, you guys basically got the two main reasons for it. There's immigration, and then there is the fact that the birth rate is a little bit higher among Muslims than among non-Muslims. And, oops, did I just zoom in? Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. So we're going to talk about the, let's talk about the first one we mentioned, the family size. So basically Muslims having more children than non-Muslims. So in the United States as a whole, the average woman will have 1.77 children during her lifetime. That's called the total fertility rate. That, of course, has changed over time. It's gone down a lot over time. In 1960, it was about twice that. It was about 3.5 children, which is higher than Algeria is now. But right now, the average woman in the United States has 1.77 children. And we don't have that exact statistic for the Muslim community in the United States. But again, the Pew Research Center has estimated that the total fertility rate for Muslims in the US is 2.5 children. So it's not a huge difference, 1.77 to 2.5, but it's big enough that it adds up over time to a higher population growth rate among American Muslims. So that's one part of it. But as you might have guessed, there's a big difference in the fertility rate between women who immigrated to the United States, what we call first generation immigrants, and those who are second, third, fourth, fifth generation, who are the children and grandchildren of immigrants. So over time, the fertility difference between non-Muslims, Muslims and non-Muslims becomes very narrow. But the difference is exaggerated by the fact that there are a lot of Muslims in the immigrant population. Okay, and then so immigration was the second. So most Muslims in the US were born abroad, as we saw earlier. And, but the percentage of American-born Muslims is growing. So that number that we saw was 42% of Muslims are born in the United States. 10 years ago, it was only 35%. So more and more Muslims are American-born. And of course, the United States has historically been a nation of immigrants, but the Muslim population in the United States was very small before the 1960s. And the reason for that is related to old American immigration laws. In the first half of the 20th century, immigration to the US was regulated by a national origins quota system, meaning each country could only send a certain number of immigrants. So specifically, the quota for each country was set at 2% of the foreign-born population of that nationality, according to the 1890 census. So what that did was it wouldn't, like very few people from, let's say that let's say that there weren't many Algerians present in the United States in 1890, which is true, then only 2% of that very small number could have immigrated to the US. So that it basically prevented, it was sort of like the opposite of the diversity visa. It kept the US less diverse. And the reason this law was, or the immigration laws were passed like that with the quota system, was in order to favor Western and Northern European countries while limiting immigrants, the admission of immigrants from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and especially, it was more specifically aimed at Southern and Eastern Europe at the time. Because specifically, historians say it was that the immigration policy in the late 19th, early 20th century was aimed to discriminate against Catholic and Jewish immigrants. But after World War II, the US was evolving as a society and beginning to tackle this legacy of racism on multiple fronts. And by the early 1960s, there were a lot of calls to reform US immigration policy, thanks in no small part to the growing strength of the civil rights movement. And this 1995 law, the 1965, sorry, law, the Immigration and Naturalization Act, has had a very substantial long-term impact on the ethnic makeup of the US, as you can see from the chart. You see it from about 1900 or 1890, after these laws went in place. Focus on the blue line more than the percent, because that's the percent of the total population. The purple one is less clear because the entire population is growing. But as the percent of population basically from 1890 or around 1900, 1910 until 1960, 1970, the number of immigrants in the US is declining the whole time. So with this Immigration and Naturalization Act, all of the national quotas were removed. And that has really changed the makeup of America. In the 1950s, more than half of all immigrants were European and just 6% were Asian. But by the 1990s, it was the other way around. Only 15% of immigrants were European and 30% were Asian. And you also had more immigrants from South America, from Africa, from the Middle East, everywhere.
Khaled, we have an answer to your question. Why do you think Muslim immigrants chose to immigrate to the United States? Hyatt K guesses opportunity.
Opportunity. That's a good answer, and it's definitely going to be one of the reasons. So if anyone else wants to start answering this question, it's why do you think Muslim immigrants chose to immigrate to the United States? Obviously, it's going to vary a lot according to personal circumstances, people's situations. But go ahead.
Uash Munir guesses also to find opportunities and also to study.
Okay, so opportunity and education, yep. And both of those are major reasons. So this is a little bit old, it's from 2007, but it's a survey among Muslim immigrants asking why they immigrated. It was about between 20 and 25% for each of the reasons. I didn't write the exact number down here, but it was educational opportunity, economic opportunity, family reasons, and then conflict and persecution. Those four were almost equal. And then a few people don't know why they immigrated to the US for whatever reason.
I don't know if this fits into the pie chart. Maybe it could be from don't know, but SSAA says that it's the influence of media and the illusion of the American dream in media that's making it US seem like an appealing place for people to move to.
So that's possibly in the don't know, the people who are questioning their decision. So the family reasons is probably referring to people who immigrated to the United States through a family-based petition, because currently US immigration policy, a large number, the majority of immigrants come in through their family ties, like a sibling or a parent or a spouse applying for a visa. immigrant visa. But then, of course, education, people could be going to the United States for education. Educational opportunity includes themselves and also their children. They could have answered that question for referring to their children. And then the last part of it was the fleeing conflict, which was at about 20%. So that's probably referring to people who were refugees resettled in the United States or who claimed asylum to flee a conflict in any part of the world. So for instance, you might have seen that Iranian Americans make up about 6% of the Muslim population, and most of them came right during and after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So in that case, they were fleeing conflict or persecution, and they would have been granted, they would have either been resettled or granted asylum in the United States for many. So here's another question. This one was inspired by you guys from the questions on the video we had on Facebook. Do you think Muslims in the United States experience discrimination?
Hayat K guesses, duh, yeah.
Okay, and so this is a topic a lot of you mentioned on the video that we put and the post on both of our pages, the Instagram and Facebook. And specifically, some people did ask about discrimination against women who wear the hijab.
Wait, I just want to correct that. I'm sorry, it wasn't Hayat K who said that. Hayat K said, no, I don't think they experience discrimination. Huash Munir said, duh, yes. Just to correct the.
Okay, thanks for that. So yeah, I keep jumping in if there are any other answers here, but it's not really easy to measure discrimination exactly. But one instrument we have are polls that ask thousands of Americans whether or not they believe there to be discrimination against various religious groups. For instance, is there discrimination against Catholics, against Buddhists, against Hindus, etc.? So in those polls, here, I'll pull it up for you guys. 82% of Americans agree that there is discrimination against Muslims in the United States, which is by far the largest group compared to other religious groups. The only one coming even close was discrimination against Jewish Americans, which was at 64%. Again, this is surveys of all Americans. So 82% of Americans agree there is discrimination against Muslims in the United States. But if you're talking about, so if you're asking that question of Muslims in the United States, like, have you personally experienced discrimination, which is a different question. Also, Muslims are the single religious group that are most likely to report having experienced religious discrimination. And interestingly, Muslim women reported higher levels of discrimination than Muslim men, which I would assume is because they're more visibly Muslim. Women wearing the hijab or the veil are more identifiably Muslim, whereas, probably the average American wouldn't know if an Algerian man was Latino or from North Africa or from the Middle East or where they were from exactly. But so some of the discrimination is targeted against women. But and after Muslims, also the second most common group to report being religiously discriminated against are Jewish Americans. And oops. And I think it's also important when we talk about discrimination to keep some historical perspective on this. Muslim Americans are not the first newcomers, if we can label them, the majority of them being relative newcomers to face discrimination. If you look at the history of the United States, there was persistent discrimination against Catholic immigrants. In the 1840s, you had waves of deadly anti-Catholic attacks, mostly against Irish immigrants. In the 1910s and 1920s, you had more anti-Catholic sentiment against Italians in particular. And it even played the role in the defeat of the first Catholic presidential candidate from a major political party in 1928. And it wasn't really until the unifying experience of World War II, kind of all Americans going over and fighting together on the same side, that anti-Catholicism began to disappear from the American political scene. And for Jewish Americans, it was a similar trajectory, I would say, sort of a similar course in very broad terms. When Jewish immigrants first began arriving to the United States in large numbers in the 1880s, fleeing persecution in Poland, Russia, and elsewhere, they encountered a lot of anti-Semitism on the societal and institutional level. For instance, Harvard University from the 1920s until the 1960s, which is not that long ago, had a quota limiting the number of Jewish students that they would admit, no more than 15%. So,
Khaled, I have a
yes.
question here for you.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of a big question, but Dina Oil asks, what can Muslims in America do to fight discrimination and Islamophobia?
Oh, so that's a good question. But remind me of that question at the very end when we open it up for Q&A, and I'll get to it then.
Okay, we'll keep that one for then.
But yeah, but everyone can keep writing questions whenever they want. But I'll try to stay on track until we get to the Q&A. So the point is that a significant Muslim population is still very new for America. And like we saw in the surveys earlier, the number of Muslims that are born in the United States is growing. It was up from 35% to 42%. But the melting pot, this is a term that Americans often use to refer to integration in the United States. The melting pot takes a generation or two. And just like the Polish or the Irish or any other group before them, Muslims are gradually becoming more integrated into American society without giving up their core beliefs. And society, for its part, is also becoming more accepting and tolerant of Muslims. So with that last idea, now I want to switch away from all the statistics and get into a personal story more. Specifically about my hometown, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Tennessee is a southern state in the south of the United States. And when I was growing up, Murfreesboro would have been considered a town, not a city. When my parents moved there in 1981, the population of Murfreesboro was only 33,000. And in terms of the racial makeup of the population, it was about 85% white, 15% black, and there weren't really many people from any other background. And Murfreesboro had historically been, it's a small town, kind of an agricultural area. But by the 1990s, Murfreesboro was going through an economic boom and growing very quickly in terms of its population. It's one of the fastest growing cities in the country, actually. And some car factories like Nissan moved into the area because they were attracted by the lower wages and weaker labor unions than in the traditional manufacturing centers like Michigan. And these factories created thousands of jobs, economic growth, and they also encouraged immigrants to the United States to move to this area. The immigrants that we have in Murfreesboro now are primarily from Mexico and other parts of Latin America, but in the past 2 decades, there have also been, or 3 decades now, there have also been a significant number of immigrants coming from across the Middle East and South Asia, such as you've had refugees from Laos and from Iraq, settled in Nashville and Murfreesboro. So, so in summary, Murfreesboro has been, because it's been one of the fastest growing cities in the country, it has also become increasingly ethnically diverse. And let's skip ahead now to 2009. At this point, there were about 1,000 Muslims living in the Murfreesboro area, and that was up from just a few, probably a handful, before the 1990s, 1980s or so. But when you get a Muslim community this size, what do you start thinking about doing? Often a Muslim community of around that size will start trying to gather donations to build a mosque. And that's what happened here. Because before that, Muslims in my town had been worshiping in, it was like basically just a large room in an industrial building. It didn't look like a mosque from the outside. It was just a regular looking room. And from the outside, it didn't look like anything like you would consider a mosque. And it was also too small at this point for the growing Muslim population. So they gathered donations from within the Muslim community and also from some outside donors, and bought land to build a mosque. And of course, when you build any new building, you have to file for a permit, a building permit. And initially the plans were going smoothly. They were getting all the approvals they needed. But then after the mosque had received approval from a local, a planning board commission, I guess it's called, opposition began to mobilize. And then at the next meeting of the same planning commission, you had 600 people show up. And usually there is nobody at a planning commission meeting. It's pretty boring stuff. But this question of whether or not the mosque was going to be built became a huge issue locally. It was all over the press, and it even made the national news on CNN and other outlets, especially after there were 2 protests organized on the same day. You had about 400 or 500 people in favor of allowing the mosque, facing off against the same number, roughly the same number, who were opposed to the mosque, right in downtown Murfreesboro in front of the old courthouse. So, I mean, you could look at this story from Murfreesboro and highlight the uglier side of it. That, you know, hundreds of people were trying to stop their fellow citizens from building a place of worship and worshiping freely, or that there might have been some Islamophobia as one of the reasons people were trying to stop the mosque. But I mean, I would argue that it has a lot of reasons for optimism too. For one thing, the United States is a rule of law country. The government cannot legally discriminate against any citizens on ethnic or religious or other considerations. And in the end, as you can see right now, the mosque was built. This is the completed mosque, and Muslims are worshiping together in peace there. But another thing that makes me optimistic is that if you look at the protesters who turned out, and my parents were both there watching the protests, what they noticed the most is that between these 2 groups of protesters, it was the age difference. They said the demonstrators in favor of the mosque were mostly college students, young adults in their 20s and 30s, and other young Americans, and mostly non-Muslims, actually. This isn't Muslims versus non-Muslims. It was people who were supportive of the idea of building the mosque versus people who were not. And on the other side, the protesters opposed to the mosque construction tended to be middle-aged and older. And I think if you had interviewed everyone on both sides of the protest, you would have found that people opposed to the mosque many of them had never met a Muslim in their lives. You know, for them, a Muslim is kind of a vague conception. It's not, you know, their friend or coworker or somebody they actually know. But for the younger protesters, it would have been completely normal to have your classmate at Middle Tennessee State University be Muslim, or to have friends at your high school who are Muslim. So maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I think that over time, over the long term, discrimination against Muslims is going to decline as it has against other immigrant groups throughout American history. So with that, I want to open it up for questions. If anybody has any other questions they wanted to ask.
Khaled, do you want to come back to Dina's question about what Muslims in America can do to fight discrimination?
Okay, so the question from Dina about fighting discrimination, or what Muslims can do to fight discrimination. It actually ties into that last point I was making, that about whether or not people have met a Muslim makes a very big difference in terms of their perception of Islam. So one study I saw said that, let's see, so about, let's see, it was 36% of Americans said they had never met any Muslims in their life or never talked to someone that is Muslim. And then about another 26% said they very rarely interacted with Muslims. But you can see a big difference in attitudes towards Islam and towards Muslims between the people who say, yes, I know a Muslim, versus the people who don't. Specifically in terms of there was one question about whether or not you view Muslims as being an important part of American society. And among the people who did not know any Muslims, 60% said no, they're not an important part of American society. Whereas that number was less than 40% for the people who said, yeah, I know Muslims. So to get back to Dina's question, what that means is Muslims, I think, should just get out, talk to people, have conversations with non-Muslims. You know, don't if you're going to the U.S. even for a visit or to study in the U.S., make friends with Americans of all types. You know, from all across the spectrum of all kinds of backgrounds. Because I think conversation and dialogue is the best way to understand each other. I could be biased because I'm a diplomat, so that's sort of our job as well. But any other questions, Emily?
I think that's a really good point, Khaled, because I think maybe sometimes people forget or don't know how gigantic the United States is. And meeting one American is not indicative of what someone else is like. So it's, you know, it's hard to understand the little pockets where maybe no one has met anyone different than them. So I think that's a very good point about mingling and sharing a background. I don't think we have any other questions at this time. We do have some questions about the best source or some advice of how to study in the US. So we're going to put links to our US Embassy exchange programs in the comments.
Okay, and we'll also do a video at some point about what the resources are. But one that I could mention for people who are trying to do a master's degree is the Fulbright Scholarship. We just published a video on our Facebook page on, I think it was on Monday or Tuesday, about this fully paid scholarship opportunity in the United States. So if you're already finishing up your undergraduate degree, your licence, or what we call in the US a bachelor's degree, and want to do a master's in the US, you could look for this fully funded scholarship opportunity.
let's see, Fanady Bait, oh, sorry, not that person. Soheeb has a question saying that there might not be racism, but does the call to prayer in mosques, like, can you hear a call to prayer in mosques in America?
That actually completely depends on the locality, the local municipality. So the United States is a federal system in that most power is actually held by the states and the local municipalities, not the federal government. So it's a local government which dictates, for instance, regulations on the level of sound. So in a lot of places it's allowed, but it can't be above a certain number of decibels, a certain sound level, basically. But I know that I did read an article just the other day that during the COVID-19, because COVID-19 and Ramadan are coinciding this year, there is one town in, I believe in Michigan, where they are actually broadcasting the call to prayer on the local television, which is unusual for, or maybe it's radio or TV, which is unusual for the US, but it's because the mosques and places of worship, all places of worship are closed due to the coronavirus measures and the lockdown. So they want to let Muslims who are living in that town know when it's time to break their fast. So they're broadcasting it over the local radio or television.
That's interesting. I would guess that that's close to where I'm from. I'm from Michigan. I'm very close to Dearborn. That was, if that's happening in Michigan, I would guess it's in Dearborn, which has a...
I was expecting it to be Dearborn, but it was some other town I hadn't heard of.
Okay. We have another question. This is from Carrie Thetford, who asks, in America, if a Muslim wants to marry someone of a different religion, does that person first have to convert, or is it acceptable to marry outside of the religion?
Okay, that's a good question. So it's completely acceptable to marry outside of one's religion in the United States because it's a civil marriage. It's the marriage that is recognized by the government is a civil marriage. So it doesn't even say what your religion is. Like some people choose to also go to a church or go to a mosque to get a document like the Ketubet Kitab or whatever. But the legal document is a civil marriage without any mention of religion. I mean, it's again, that goes back to church and state, which is the separation between the government and all religions. The government cannot favor religion or cannot favor any single religion against others. I think you're muted. Okay, there.
Okay, I think that's all the questions that we have coming in. So I don't know if you want to make any closing remarks or.
I didn't prepare any closing remarks, but thank you all for showing up. And we'd love to see in the comments if you have any suggestions for future topics you would like to hear about. Clearly, there's some interest in scholarships and studying in the United States, but anything else that we could do a live video on, either on our Facebook page or here on YouTube. And as I said, we will be trying to do more content specifically on our YouTube page. So be sure to hit that subscribe button down below you on the right. So down there.
Great.
So
thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. And thank you for everyone who watched on YouTube. Stay safe.